Hello, friends, and welcome to the Cinemondo podcast with just me. I'm doing a 10-part series about a TV series called Dekalog, which was co-written and directed by Kieslowski, who you may know from the Colors trilogy films, brilliant filmmaker. Interesting series. It's a 10-part series. Each episode is an hour, so each episode is a film, like a fully fleshed out story on its own. Each anthology, each story stands on its own. Allegedly, they're all sort of based on the Ten Commandments, which I wouldn't have guessed that unless somebody told me. So they're very loosely based on the Ten Commandments, and I feel like it's kind of a very loose thing to base something on because Ten Commandments are so basic that just about every movie ever made could be said to be based on one of the Ten Commandments. If you know what I mean, there's always going to be, like somebody lies or somebody is murdered or somebody steals something. You're going to see that in just about every movie you watch. But in this series, we're in a location that carries through all 10 episodes. And it's an apartment complex in communist Soviet era Poland in Warsaw, and it's got that grim look of those sort of brutalist buildings and situations. The scenes that we see out in the streets, they all seem a little overcast and gray and a little depressing. And this is perhaps the most depressing episode. This is episode 5. Each episode is simply named a number, so this is called Dekalog 5. This one is kind of a notorious episode. The filmmaker also made a more feature-length film version of this episode. I believe it's called A Short Film About Death, and this is an episode, I believe, that is based on the Thou Shalt Not Kill. Each episode has originally Kieslowski was going to get each episode directed by a different director, but he ended up deciding to direct them all himself. But he did use a different director of photography, a different cinematographer for each episode, except for 2 had the same DP. But this episode has cinematography by someone whose name I dare to pronounce. Sladmir Idziak. I hope I pronounced that properly, but it's very stylized the way this is filmed. I think he was using some sort of filters on the lenses. I'm not sure if he used a post-production technique, but there seems to be like a dark vignette around the screen, almost like we're looking at it through an opening somehow, or through a porthole or a window, because there's sort of almost a blurred darkness around the edge, and the colors seem saturated in a way that still maintains this almost colorless feel of this Soviet era apartment housing area and downtown kind of area. And we see several people going through their daily lives in this episode. A taxi driver is washing his taxi, and seems like people maybe don't like him. He also seems like not the nicest guy. He's like honks his horn when somebody's walking their dogs, and it scares the dogs, and he laughs. He's just kind of a jerk, And we see a young attorney who appears to be just starting out and very earnest and very altruistic feeling to him. You get the impression that he has got a kind of naive way of looking at the law, like, I want to do good, I want to be good. And it seems like the elder people around him, his advisors, the other lawyers, the older prosecutors or defense lawyers, are basically telling him, look, you have a very naive view of how this works. The other character we see is a kind of punk rock looking guy. He looks just like Johnny Rotten kind of guy walking through the streets of Warsaw. And this guy is just a jackass. He's not a nice guy. He drops a rock on an overpass and it hits a car and he just walks away. He sees a guy getting beat up and he just watches and he doesn't do anything. They do a couple of little vignettes, little scenes, little moments in his day that show you that he is kind of a sociopath. Maybe just doesn't care, isn't, And then the lives of those three people that we see, we cut back and forth to them here and there. And I want to make sure that you know that the way I'm reviewing these is I'm giving spoilers. I'm spoiling bits of the story. So you need to watch this show unless you're okay with spoilers, because these aren't the kind of stories that have twist, like wow, twist ending. They're really, I mean, it's kind of hard. The concept of having a spoiler with stories like this doesn't work the way it does with other stories. In some cases, it's you can spoil it just by telling somebody what's going to happen, but there's not a real twist or anything in most of the stories. So anyway, what happens is the punk rock guy, the young sort of sociopathic punk guy, ends up murdering the cab driver guy in this really brutal, ruthless murder scene. You just despise this guy. As much as you didn't like the cab driver, you have a lot of sympathy for him because he's not a criminal. He's not really a terrible guy. He's just not a nice guy, which gives us another one of those sort of ethical questions in this series, which I think is really interesting. They didn't make him this angelic taxi driver whose murder is a heartfelt tragedy. It is a heartfelt tragedy, but you didn't really like him. So you're not exactly saying, oh, good, he's dead. You're saying, he's not a nice guy, but he was a real guy, and a living guy doesn't deserve to die. So your judgment of him earlier in the episode is kind of twisted a little bit when you see him going through such a horrible experience at the end of his life. You're like, oh, and you almost feel like, gosh, I'm so sorry I judged him earlier. And then the guy who kills him, you just hate this guy. He's just a sociopath. He's a heartless, brutal killer. He kills this guy. And then we cut to the final part of the story where we don't see how he was caught, but he is caught, and he is in a courtroom. And his defense attorney is this young attorney that we've gotten to know in the early part of the story. And he is doing his best to defend his client, but not the innocence. He's not. It appears that he is not expressing that he feels his client is innocent, but that he is trying to save him from the death penalty. And that is, I guess, the crux of his case is that he wants to talk the court out of, executing his client. And in that, he fails, and he feels like the biggest failure, and he feels almost, he feels, in a way responsible for the guy being, led away to his death, and sees him through a window being led in cuffs to the police vehicle, and he shouts to him, like, almost like he's got this feeling of remorse, like, oh my God, I let this guy down. I let him die. And even though now, as viewers, we have watched through the window, as I keep saying, and we know what that guy did. Because we know what his client did because we were there. We saw, And it's almost like you want to reach through the film and tell the defense attorney, it's like, no, he's bad. This guy is terrible. Look what he did. Watch this video. But you don't. You see it from his point of view. You see it from now the defendant's point of view. And he suddenly in the story seems pathetic. I mean, he's in his prison outfit. He seems pathetic. And you start realizing that his upbringing, his life, his experiences, his struggles, whatever, may have led to that. But no excuse, obviously. No excuse for murder, obviously, but you do get a sense in this latter part of it that the story is a bit of an indictment of the death penalty, because it shows the death penalty. It shows it being carried out in the way that that they do it or did it at this point, 1988 in Poland, which is pretty brutal and ugly and stark and almost out of control, kind of just a bunch of guys getting together to kill someone, and you got that question in your mind: what are the ethics of killing someone who killed someone, to show that killing is bad, or to deter other killers, or to punish him, or to what is the reason for capital punishment? Some people just like the idea. It's like, oh, he got what he deserved, he should die, and they don't really think about what it really involves as far as the ethics of taking a life, to show that taking a life is bad. Like, if murder is the ultimate crime, deserving of the ultimate punishment, then why is that punishment exactly the same thing that the person is being punished for? And in other cases, you have to also question whether or not the court system is always accurate in death penalty cases. If you're one of these people who is deluded into thinking that the courts never fail, the police never arrest the wrong person, witnesses never misidentify people, and that anytime somebody is sentenced to death, it's always because they're guilty, then you don't really understand human nature, human behavior, or how the courts work, how the defense and prosecutors use different techniques and tactics against each other and against their clients, how the police may want to protect their own reputation or whatever. Anyway, I could go on and on about this, but death penalty issues are very interesting. This presents a death penalty issue in a way that's interesting as far as how brutal it is, and we're shown that idea of the murder that we see in the first part is kind of an analogy to the murder that we see in the second part. And I say that because on the death certificate, at least in America, when a person is executed, the cause of death is listed as homicide. So it is a killing. A person is purposefully killed. So that's my review of this episode. It's a pretty heavy one. It's pretty hard to watch. It's not a pleasant one in any way. There's really nothing pleasant or redeeming as far as the characters. The only thing there is a really brief segment at the very end where you see the young attorney kind of chastising himself, I guess, or feeling like a failure because he had to witness this execution, and he is just being brutal with himself after all this, and I guess he feels, and he'll probably carry it with him, and as the older attorney said, or implied, you really have to let that go. You're too emotional to be an attorney. You're too ethical is what it seems they were saying, to be an attorney. And so at the end, you see him sort of beating himself up about this. He's just so upset about it, and that brings us to the end, and it leaves us with a lot of questions, like the rest of these stories. Leaves us with a lot of moral questions about how we feel about things, how we judge people, how we judge situations, how we think, what is punishment? Should it be punishment, or should it be rehabilitation? Should we care about someone if after they murder somebody so brutally and heartlessly? What do we owe anyone like that? Do we owe them anything? Is the death penalty a good thing, even though perhaps some innocent people are executed here and there? Is that a price that we should be willing to pay? Anyway, that's my review of Dekalog 5. So far, the most brutal episode, hardest to watch. But again, the cast is brilliant. The cinematography is really interesting. There's a lot of darkness in the frame. You almost get the feeling like you're seeing this through the eyes of someone with a limited vision, or through, you're looking through that window I keep talking about. And there are symbols of windows and barriers throughout the series, and this film itself seems to be behind a barrier, like you're looking through a darkened window at this entire story, which is interesting in itself if you think about that. But yeah, let me know what you think of it if you're watching along with me. Thanks for listening. Thanks for getting this far through it. And I will talk to you again real soon.